let's talk about this game, my favorite board game of all time. Now, I've actually covered this game before. It was the very first board gem, the very first video I ever did. Don't go back and view it. It's old, it's not very good quality. I was just doing it for fun to keep myself busy during the pandemic. I feel like I should return to it with a little bit more quality to it. And now is a good time to do it because of a very new edition that's come out from Dice Tree just late 2022, early 2023 when I'm recording. So let's talk about Ave Caesar. Or is it Caesar? Ave Caesar originally came out in 1989, this edition from Ravensburger. We have other editions here. This is QJet 21XX from Möbius Games, which is in Japan. And then 2006-ish, we have this version of Ave Caesar from Pro Ludo, which was later, I think, purchased by Asmodee. Then we didn't see anything for a while, and then this version here from Grow in Brazil, so Portuguese edition. This one, I think, around 2016. And finally, this one, the Dice Tree edition from Korea, but it has English rules in the box. Ave Caesar is a chariot racing board game for 2 to 6, 3 to 6 players. Generally speaking, you wouldn't play it with 2 or 3, although the new game does come with rules on how to play sort of a team variant where each player plays multiple chariots. You have a deck of cards with different values, numbered 1 to 6. On your turn, you play one, draw one. Pretty simple. Move forward that number of spaces. So what's the catch? There's a couple. For one thing, blocking, extremely common in this game. Some lanes have more spaces than other lanes. So you might be pushed around the outside, which will use up some of your movement. And you only have just a little bit more movement in your deck than is needed to complete 3 laps. So if you go around the outside one too many times, it's possible you will run out of cards before you cross the finish line. Ave Caesar was originally designed by Wolfgang Riedesser, and it was designed in the 70s. There is an auto racing version of Ave Caesar. Ausgebremst was a version from ASS, Altenburger und Stralsunder Spielkartenfabriker. Apparently they're a really, really old playing card company. It is a tiny, tiny bit more involved, but not in a way that a hobbyist would have any sort of problem with. And it has various tracks that you can, like multiple boards you can fit together to have a variety of tracks. So you can almost think of the Dice Tree edition of Ave Caesar as sort of unifying Ave Caesar and Ausgebremst, taking the best parts of Ausgebremst and including them in Ave Caesar with the variable tracks, and also as variants, the ability to kind of specialize your deck of cards a little bit. Anyway, I'm going to show you how it plays. I'm going to use this version, and hang on until the end because I do have a Q&A. I was able to send some questions to the designer, Wolfgang Riedesser, and he was very nice to send me some responses. The Q&A will come at the end of the video after I tell you why it's still a gem today, which will be after I teach you how to play, which is after now. To set up the game, first you're going to want to pick a track. This edition from Dice Tree has a few different ways you can set up the boards for 8 different tracks. They give you a small deck of cards that allows you to randomly choose a track. So we will be doing the Hippodrome Constantinople. Or is it Istanbul? Each player gets a chariot, 1 coin, and a deck of cards numbered 1 to 6. There should be 24 cards, 4 of each value. Each player shuffles up their deck and then splits. High value will go first, and repeat in the case of ties. The start player is going to place their chariot on the 1 space, and then clockwise from there, 2, the 3, the 4, 5, and 6. I'm assuming you're playing a 4 to 6 player game. If you are playing with 2 or 3 players, you may want to consider each player playing multiple chariots. If you're playing with fewer than 6, you may want to fill out the grid, so to speak, by adding AI players, basically, that behave in a very simple manner. But each player will again shuffle their deck and have a starting hand of 3 cards. And each player takes the coin and puts it in front of them for now, and they're ready to begin. In Ave Caesar, players are going to be racing around the track, doing 3 laps total. The player who finishes the 3rd lap first wins the race. Each player, at some point during the race, has to land on one of these 4 spaces in what can be called the Emperor's Row. And in that way, they're going to be turning in their coin. Players must turn in their coin at one point during the race, at the end of the 1st or at the end of the 2nd lap. Any player who is unable to do so, or for some reason chooses not to do so, cannot win. Play is very simple. You play any of the 3 cards in your hand and move that exact number of spaces. If you are unable to play a card that moves the exact number of spaces, you must pass. But if you're able to play, you must. Players in the starting row cannot begin with a 6. That's a rule during the race as well, that any player who is in the lead or tied for the lead may not play a 6. So a player plays a card in front of them and moves that many spaces, either straight ahead or diagonally. You cannot cross a wall. Now, because you must play a card if you're able, if green, for example, has a hand of nothing but 4 or more, and they must play if they're able, then they will play a card and move forward that many spaces. The catch being that there are walls that separate branches, and the inner lane is often shorter than the outer lane. You have basically just enough cards to finish 3 laps, with a little bit extra. That means that if you take the outside lane too many times, it's possible you won't have enough cards left in your deck in order to finish the race. Cards that are played never come back. You never shuffle your discard piles to form a new draw deck. So play is clockwise from there. In this case, blue, who's going next, must play something 3 or less. Players are not allowed to land on or go through spaces that are occupied. So if a blue has a 2, for example, or 3, they could play. But if they have nothing but 4 or more, they must pass. A player who is in the lead or tied for the lead cannot play a 6. So one player cannot just get a lead and then keep it for the whole race, because you're going to need those 6s in order to finish. There are some points where the track narrows, and in these narrowing tracks, if a player occupies this spot, then no players behind them are able to pass. In this case, blue and brown must play a 1 or pass if it is their turn. The big part of the game is blocking these choke points, blocking the inner lanes, and forcing other players to take the outside with the hope that maybe they won't have enough cards to finish the race. At the end of lap 1 or at the end of lap 2, a player must pit, so to speak, and that is land on one of these 4 spaces. So from here, red could play a 3, 4, 5, or 6, assuming they weren't in the lead. And as long as they land on one of these 4 spaces, they can turn in their coin and stand up and say, Ave Caesar! Very important. Don't let anybody off the hook for that. Everybody has to declare it loudly and proudly. Play continues clockwise, and you go around the lap 3 times. The first player to cross a finish line wins the game. That's it. Pretty simple. You're ready to play Ave Caesar. If you are playing with dummy players, for the very first turn, just draw a random card from the deck and move forward that many spaces if they are able to. If they can't move that exact number of spaces, they just pass. And then after that, you don't need the dummy player's deck of cards anymore. Instead, when it's the dummy's turn, and all the dummy players happen before the start player takes their next turn, they move a number of spaces depending on their position in the race. A dummy player who is in the lead or tied for the lead will move forward 2 spaces. A dummy player who is in last place or tied for last place will move forward 6 spaces, and in between they'll move 4 spaces. Dummy players must always move to their own advantage, and unless a dummy player can move the full number of spaces, they don't move at all. Attacking. Wouldn't be a chariot race without attacking, so you can try this variant. Any player whose chariot is next to a space and has an empty space in front of them is vulnerable to being attacked. A player who plays the right number to run up alongside them, in this case a 4 say, has the option of attacking. This player draws a replacement, so they have 3 cards in their hand again, and then declare that they're attacking. The 2 players who are fighting reveal their highest card. If that's a tie, the next highest card. And if that's a tie, then their third and final card. If that's still a tie, nothing happens, but the player who reveals a card higher than their opponent will move forward to an empty space, and the player who has the lower card has to move back 1 space. A successful attack earns its owner a token, which can be worth 1 point at the end of the race. Ave Caesar is fine just to play a single race, but if you want to, and the game encourages this, you could play multiple races, and next time you can continue with a different track, but keep track of the scores. What if yellow wants to pit this lap, but does not have a 1? You have to play a card if you're able to play a card, so if yellow doesn't have a 1, they must blast past, right? Well, officially, according to the rules, no. If they want to pit, they can choose to pass and wait for the pit lane to free up. A variant means they have to drive past. If that's the first lap, then they'll have to try again on the second lap. And if they can't on the second lap, then they're hosed. I always play with this rule. There is some room for preparation of the deck beforehand. This version of the game comes with some extra cards, some extra 5s and 6s that allow you to customize your deck. You can have more 5s and 6s and fewer 1s and 2s. The advantage is obvious. What's the disadvantage? Well, you have fewer cards in your deck because the sum of all the cards in your deck has to be the same. So if you have more 5s and 6s and fewer 1s and 2s, you're going to have fewer cards in your deck. Now that's potentially good because you can travel the same distance in fewer cards. That's good, right? Well, not if you have to pass because you're getting blocked. All players can take their cards and divide them however they wish into 4 piles in front of them. During play, instead of having 3 cards in their hand, they only have 2. But after they play one, they can choose which of the 4 piles to draw from. So it gives them a little bit more control when they're looking for a particular card, but less control because they have fewer cards in hand. And you can combine those 2 variants. If you're playing with 2 or 3 players, you can play such that each player controls 3 or 2 chariots. For each chariot a player controls, they have a deck of cards in front of them, and in their hand they will have 2 cards for each chariot. When their turn comes around, they can choose the order that the chariots move in. Very simple game with lots of variation. I find that these days, a more common complaint among people on, for example, Board Game Geek, they're more likely to complain a game is too simple than it is to say it's too complicated. But a complicated racing game, to me, doesn't really work. You know, whenever a player's turn comes around, just like, okay, they're thinking, maybe they're planning out their move a little bit, and then it's a really long time before your turn comes around. It doesn't feel like a race, does it? You want a racing game to feel fast. You want the turns to be fast. You want the decisions to be interesting, ideally, but it shouldn't sacrifice the speed of the game. A racing game should feel fast. And Ave Caesar really excels at this because it's a really, really simple racing game. Certainly when you look at a single turn, you're probably going to be like, oh, well, that's too simple, right? The cards only are numbered 1 to 6. You'll have a hand of 3 of them, you play one of them. But you got to think over the course of the whole race. You can't play 6s unless you are not in the lead. And that's a very, very nice touch. It's a very nice thing because it keeps that runaway leader from running away. So you have somebody who jumps out ahead in the lead, and they're in the lead, but what you're going to see is you're going to start them slowing down because their hand might fill up with sixes and they can't play them. So if I get a sense that the leader has a hand full of sixes and they're going to have a hard time playing, maybe they're slowing down, I'm coming up, but I don't pass them, I tie them. On their next turn, even if they're just tied for the lead, they can't play a six. And if they have a handful of sixes, they have to pass. And I like to, cycle my cards so that I always have a variety in my hand. If I have a 2, and a 4, I'm more likely to play a 2 because I want to get it out of my hand so that on my turn I have 3 cards and hopefully 3 different values. I have more variety. But it's not the only factor, of course. I'm trying to think about, well, there's a pinch point coming up. Ideally, I'd want to get in there. And of course, if I have more cards of different values, then I have more options. Maybe one of them hopefully will get me in there so I can block other people. But if I can't, at least let me get through there so somebody doesn't block me. But there's tons of choke points and there's tons of branches that can cause players to go around the outside. And a brilliant part of the game is the finish. Brilliant idea of having just enough cards in your deck to get across the finish line with a little bit extra, but not much. What that means is that if a player has to go around the outside a number of times, if they do it too many times, they're wasting those spaces and they're not going to be able to have enough left over in their deck to cross the finish line. But of course, you don't know that for sure. It's only when they're approaching the end of that third lap, they're approaching the finish line, and they're playing 2s or something, and they're like, well, are they going to have enough to get across the finish line? Usually, just enough. But maybe not. So somebody who's in the lead might run out of gas, so to speak, just before they cross the finish line, and then somebody zooms past them. Great fun, and it makes for an exciting finish. And these elements together make Ave Caesar almost the ideal racing game. It's a racing game in which being in the lead has a disadvantage, and you don't know for sure the results until the end. Even just the fact that the turn order is clockwise around the table. A lot of racing games, they play so that the whoever is in the lead goes first, whoever is in second goes second, and so on every round. This is the case in something like Formula Day. They're trying to prevent the possibility of somebody coming up behind and then blocking this person, right? Not necessarily realistic, but fun. And Ave Caesar leans into that. With the clockwise turn order, it's possible somebody is going to come up in front and block you, and you have nothing to do but to pass. Frustrating? Have a laugh, shake your fist, and try to get back at them next game. Really. It's almost best played as sort of a multi-race game. You can assign points at the end of a race. Write them down on a piece of paper, stick them in the box. Next time you play with the same people, add the results. Play a different track, record the results again. Well, I mean, it adds a bit of context, certainly, but it also levels out the luck. There are lots of games, you play 3 rounds and they're all identical. And people say, well, I don't want to play 3 rounds. I want to play 1 round. If they're all identical, let's just play once, right? But a lot of times that one game is going to be really swingy. And the reason you play multiple rounds is to even out that swing of luck. Ave Caesar is short enough that you could play multiple races in a single session. The luck doesn't bother me. I think it's a fun and exciting race, and it tells a story by the end, and usually people are angry at each other and cursing and blocking each other. It's great fun for an active crowd that can really get into it. This new edition has a total of 8 different tracks, and it's 8 different tracks assuming you're just playing in one direction clockwise. There's nothing stopping you from playing the other direction too, so you'd have 16 tracks. So you can make a whole season out of it. And certainly that will even out the luck. A single race is swingy, but it's also exciting. There is a pull in different directions where you have people who want a fast and exciting game, race, but they don't want it to be too lucky. And it's like, those are kind of almost opposites. You need luck in a game like this. You don't want the winner to be a foregone conclusion halfway, 2/3 of the way into the race. But there has to be a way for people to catch up that's beyond skill, because all other things being equal, players going to have, generally equal skill levels. So what's the difference? The luck. There are some games, I'm not going to name them, but there are some games that busy the players with lots of thinking to do, but still that ceiling isn't very high, which means that all the players can kind of reach it, which means that all the players are kind of relatively equal skill level, which means the winner is still down to the tiny, tiny little bit of luck that might be in the game. I hate that much, much more than having just very obvious swingy luck in a game, which is a more exciting conclusion, and it doesn't make me have to do a lot of work to get the same result. All right, Ave Caesar is not necessarily a strategic game. There are decisions to make. That ceiling is not very high. You're playing for the fun of it. You're playing for the interaction with the other players, shaking your fist when you get blocked, and not caring so much about who wins or loses. The goal is to try to win. Winning is the goal, but it's not the point. The point is to have fun. There are decisions to be made, and I'm not saying they're complex decisions, but you could lose the game by playing randomly. That should tell you something. There's still decisions to be made, and it's still fun, and I will say that the new version comes with a bunch of variants, as well as Ausgebremst, actually, that can introduce a little bit of planning to the game. One of the variants is you can build your deck at the beginning of the game. You can actually choose the makeup of your deck. One of, I think, 3 different makeups. So some of them have more high cards and fewer low cards, but also fewer cards overall. So that's considered a faster deck. So every turn, on average, you're going to be moving faster because you have more high cards, but you have fewer turns to get to the finish line. Instead of having 1 draw pile, you can have 4 draw piles. And at the beginning of the game, you take your deck, and you basically just decide where each card goes in each pile. And on your turn, you choose one of the 4 piles to draw. The catch is, now you only have 2 cards to choose from. So these are all variants. They're fine. I don't play with them myself, only because it just takes a while to get through that part. I'd rather just jump in and have a race. So I usually don't do that, but it does offer some more planning at the beginning of the race. So it's nice that Dice Tree took some of those elements of Ausgebremst and incorporated them, and even included extra components to allow you to do that. One thing that's quite welcome is basically official rules on how to play with 2 or 3 players. So each player has 2 or 3 chariots. There is also rules, which you can incorporate these rules into other versions of Ave Caesar as well, that basically it adds dummy players. They're not going to win, but they do sometimes get in the way, which is what you want. Attacking. It was always something that felt missing to a lot of people in Ave Caesar. And if you're going to set it in Circus Maximus, you expect, some whipping or something. So they've incorporated that in a really, really nice, simple way. If you do multiple races, I do encourage you to add that sort of attacking element, be able to award extra points. I always play with the rule, and it's an optional rule, but I always play with this option, where you're not allowed to pass if you're waiting to get into the lane to hail Caesar. It's part of the challenge, like when you're coming up to at the end of the first lap, it's like, should I pit? Is now a good time? I see a lot of people pitting. Maybe I should wait. But the risk is, of course, if you wait and do it the next lap, maybe there's fewer people who are pitting. But if you can't pit that time, you're hosed, right? So what happens if you're hosed, if you can't win? There's still things to do. You still try to place. You won't get the points for placing, but you will keep other players from moving up in the places. And in that context, in the greater context of a season or just multiple races where you're keeping score, makes a difference. And because successful attacks give you points, it can be fun when when somebody who is effectively eliminated from the race, who won't score any points, but is just trying to attack everybody, right? Trying to get points that way. It's a lot of fun. Board gaming is a huge umbrella, and there's so many different types of games. There are solo games, and there are those pseudo half RPG games, legacy games, that campaign games. And I find a lot of modern hobbyists, even when they want a shorter, simpler game, they still need some meat there. A really simple game is just not going to engage them. People become accustomed to more mechanisms, more complexity, and there's the feeling the need to have more to do, more to think about, otherwise you get bored. I guess I just want people to ask why they're playing board games. What are they trying to get out of board games? If they're trying to get a puzzle, which is very common nowadays, the puzzle in how to score the most points, right? What's the path through the labyrinth of the game mechanisms that allow me to win by 2 points? If you're looking for a puzzle, and that's what you enjoy in games, this might not be for you. I personally really enjoy games that have simple rules that just melt away. And hey, I like some complex stuff too. This is a game that every time I play, I have a big smile on my face the whole time. It's super, super fun. And I get into it. Sometimes I'll play and I'll block people, and people are like, you didn't even have to block me. Like, well, you didn't have to. I would think your best move would be to go as far as possible. And I was like, yeah, but I could block you, so I did. That's funny. I pull into the lane to hail Caesar, and I do that, and somebody pulls up right behind me. And I just move one space. I'm blocking them. It's like, come on, you need to go. Get out. Right? I'm like, no, I'm good. I'm just cruising here, in the pit lane. If you're going to be frustrated with that sort of thing, maybe stay away from Ave Caesar. But with the right crowd, oh, it's a hoot. I own a restaurant, right? And you'll see it in the end. They technically sponsor this. One time, very early in the restaurant's life, Ludica's life, we had a guest, Tom Felber. Now, Tom Felber is a Swiss gentleman who used to be, for a number of years, the head of the Spiel des Jahres jury. And there was a bunch of us, a couple of designers too, and industry people, and maybe about 10 or 12 of us. And we just went around the table and we all introduced ourselves and what is our favorite game. So when I introduced myself, I said my favorite game is Ave Caesar, which probably says something about myself. In my memory, Tom Felber had a big smile on his face and he nodded like this. Because he is definitely familiar with Ave Caesar, and he knows what kind of experience that is. Editions. So this is the original Ravensburger. Still very, very good. Nice big board, lots of variety in the tracks. Never had an English edition, so it would be hard to find in North America at least. Those long box Ravensburger, Amigo games, it's longer than that. This is kind of going more toward like old Milton Bradley style boxes, so it's a bit annoying to store. Q-Jet, the Japanese edition, exactly the same game, same track, same everything. Obviously, it's a different setting. The quality of the board is very poor, but the pieces are marvelous metal pieces, and it is the smallest edition. So this is my portable edition. When I'm going to a game night somewhere, game session, I'll take this one with me because this is Carcassonne size, but a little bit narrower. I will say I love all the editions except this one. This is the Pro Ludo edition from 2006, and this was the first English edition. I mean, components are fine, but there's less variety in the tracks compared to the old Ave Caesar and Q-Jet, and the tracks are shorter, which means that it's much less likely for players to run out of gas, so to speak, before they cross the finish line. That's an exciting part of the game. Yes, that person came out into a big lead, but will they be able to finish? In this version of Ave Caesar, yeah, probably. They made the track shorter, and it's a real shame. It certainly works, and if you're still playing with like 5 or 6 players, you're still getting into each other's way. It's still fun, but you're not getting the full Ave Caesar experience with it. Jump ahead about 10 years to this one. This is from Grow, 2016-ish, something like that. Grow is a publisher in Brazil. So this is a Portuguese edition. Again, not in English, so you would have to import this. It's a fixed version of this one. It sort of has the same basic tracks, but made more challenging, made longer, with more walls. And this edition does have the single most brutal track in all of them. And then finally we have Dice Tree. Now I will say the Dice Tree edition, because this is their bookshelf kind of format, a lot of deluxe editions of classic games come out in this format. So like, for example, another one I have is Modern Art. And Modern Art, I mean, it's amazing. Not only it comes with metal coins and a wooden gavel, right, for the auctions. It's incredible. This is not deluxe in the classic sense, okay? There are no, like, fancy pieces. But it is the best version of Ave Caesar. It's got a huge variety of boards, good quality pieces. It's got extra components for you to play with a bunch of variants that are unique to this edition, which you can play if you add components to the other ones. But anyway, they're built into this edition. But it's not a traditionally what I would consider a deluxe edition. It's just simply the best edition of Ave Caesar that's ever been made. I should quickly mention Ausgebremst. Plays absolutely fine, and it's got a lot of variety, but from a modern point of view, you're going to be disappointed with the presentation because it's very kind of old-fashioned, cartoony art, and the pieces, the racing cars, are cardboard standees. But content-wise, it's fine. It's just also a really big box. So this is I would say about the same as a typical long box Ravensburger Amigo game, just a little bit thicker. Approximately. In terms of gameplay, I would recommend all of them except this one, the Pro Ludo edition, which is, for English speakers, this is going to be the easiest one for you to find used. And unfortunately, it's the worst version. Not terrible, but a disappointment. In terms of like production quality, I'm actually really happy with all of them. I think a lot of people would not really be very happy with Ausgebremst. And if you're getting Q-Jet, you have to know what you're getting into, because the board it doesn't really lay flat, and I don't dare backbend it. It's not even like finished on the sides. It seems like it's almost like bare cardboard. I mean, I'm exaggerating. Yeah, it's not the best board. It's a kind of a small board. Usually you want like a bigger board if you're playing a game that plays up to 6 players. And of course, being in a tiny little box, it's a tiny little board. Generally speaking, my favorite ones to recommend to people would be the original Ravensburger, or the one from Grow, or the new Dice Tree one. I will have a separate video where I do my best to compare these editions, which is going to be challenging. I've never tried to do a side-by-side comparison of 6 different games, but we'll see how I make out. It is always a pleasure when the designer of a game reaches out to me after I publish a video. When Wolfgang Riedesser sent me an email, actually sent an email to my restaurant, but it got to me. Obviously, I was thrilled, and I thought, hey, this is a good opportunity for me to redo Ave Caesar in a more, up to current standards of this video channel, which is, not amazing quality, but better than it used to be. So I've done a Q&A before. This is exactly the same format, which basically I sent a bunch of questions over to him. I just ask a question and I'm reading out the answer. I know it's a video form. It would be amazing to do some sort of video chat, but the fact is that I want to make it easy on the designers. Over the course of this video, I'll try to put in some photos that Wolfgang was very nice to include of the original prototype. So if I'm not mistaken, you live in Ravensburg. Did you live there in the late 80s? And is it a coincidence that Ave Caesar and a number of your other games were published by Ravensburger? How did that initial partnership start? Well, it is a nice coincidence and a pretty long story too, but I'll try to keep it short. It all started in the late 70s in Ireland when I invented my first game, a car racing game, and just for fun. It happens to be the predecessor of Ave Caesar. Yes, amazing how old the game is. The basic rules are actually still the same. I have to smile when people say that Ave Caesar is like Daytona 500 or Flamme Rouge or other race games. I guess Ave Caesar is much older than most. More inventions followed, not just games, so I started looking for manufacturers who were interested in my ideas. After trying out London, Berlin, and other places, I eventually ended up settling back home in the south of Germany where I was born and grew up, just about 10 miles from the cozy little town of Ravensburg. It was a bit like coming home, being on the road for many crazy, wild years. Being neighbors, it was only natural to show the car racing game to Ravensburger first, even though I didn't have any personal connections whatsoever. That was in 1979. Ravensburger liked the game, didn't like the theme. At the time, dying forests through air pollution was a major concern in Europe, and somehow the idea of racing cars charging around a track just wasn't too popular. Okay, no problem. Didn't stop me putting my life on the game line. I loved the idea of being a games inventor now, and nobody could stop me. Even though I was pretty broke, I was rich in happiness and pretty content with my life, and was lucky to have a soulmate who had boundless faith in me. Oh, that gives me so much joy to read that. And at some stage, the first little success came along, with Schmidt-Spiel in 1984, Ravensburger in 1986, etc. 9 years later, in 1988, I had the idea of relocating the F1 racing game to the ancient Circus Maximus in Rome and showed it to Ravensburger again. Now they loved the game and the theme. Bingo! Did you have particular goals in mind when starting the design process for this game? Emotions you wanted the players to feel, or perhaps requirements Ravensburger suggested in terms of game length or simplicity so it would better fit their catalog. The game worked from the onset and Ravensburger liked everything about it. When I invented the game back in Dublin, I just liked the idea of simulating the emotions of a car race, not the action. The emotional challenge for position and the checkered flag was my goal. For this, I came up with the following simple mathematical formula, which inevitably results in generating lots of emotional interaction between the players. A guarantee for hilarious play fun. If all players have the same number of moving points in the form of cards, the race will always end up being close. What happens during the game, playing which cards, making which move, has of course implications, but you really only find out which when you reach the finish line, or not. This guarantees a permanent up and down of hope and fear. 3 rounds turned out to be ideal for a game length of approximately 30 minutes. I found that playing on different tracks with different lengths, curve combinations, chicanes, etc. felt like playing different games, and the game length easily accommodated a series of games. So it made a lot of sense to have a variety of tracks available to play a tournament. The tracks for the car race were based on the Hockenheim, Brands Hatch, Monza, and Monaco racetracks. Each track has its own characteristics and personality and level of difficulty, but basically any racetrack in the world would work. I've already adapted many of them. And with that very effective no 6 card in the lead rule, nobody can just drive away to a clear victory. The simple rules make it easy for everyone. Easy to learn, but challenging to play. The game has undoubtedly stood the test of time. Invented 45 years ago. Hey, were you even born then? No comment. It still works and people still love playing it. They absolutely do, and I'm certainly one of them. I like to picture a different past. And what if when Ave Caesar was originally pitched to Ravensburger or another publisher with the auto racing setting, that it was accepted? And what if, as an auto racing game, it was a big success? because the original prototype had real-world tracks like Monza and Hockenheim. Just imagine what later Formula Day would do, right? Have tons of real-world tracks that you could buy, and you're racing those tracks. People would have lots of fun with Formula Day, have like a big season, right? You keep track of the points between seasons, between races in a season. Imagine, but it was Ave Caesar that had that success and not Formula Day. A different timeline. Now, the next question he's already answered, but I'll still read it out. Did it always have a chariot racing setting, or did the publisher decide that? The side lane to Hail Caesar could also be mistaken for a pit lane. As I already mentioned, my idea of changing the car race to a chariot race theme was the breakthrough to get publishers interested in the game. The pit lane feature was an inherent part of the original game, and I loved it. That's why I came up with the idea of an Imperator lane, to hail the Imperator, throw a coin in the grandstand, and shout, Ave Caesar! This finally led to the game title. My original title was Circus Maximus. Ravensburger would have liked to call it Ben-Hur, but there were copyright issues. You see games coming out now about Rear Window, and other old movies. You could do it now. I'm sure Paramount or MGM or whoever it is that has the rights to Ben-Hur, I'm sure that they would be willing to accept some money in exchange for a Ben-Hur board game. I mean, they're not making much money off the license now anyway, right? So I bet they'd be very willing. Of course, the auto racing version of Ave Caesar is Ausgebremst, published by Altenburger Spielkarten in 1993. How did this edition come about? Did you have more ideas after Ave Caesar's publication for a further evolution of the rule set, or were those ideas already there and removed to make for a simpler experience in Ave Caesar? Well, Ave Caesar sold well in the first year, but didn't quite meet Ravensburger's expectations. After 2 years, the game was taken out of their program and the license was returned to me. In 1993, the product manager at ASS had the idea of doing a series of The Best Of by established game inventors, and the first two candidates were my dear colleague Alex Randolph and myself. I was certainly honored and didn't hesitate a second. That was the chance for my car racing game. Anyhow, I'd already developed Ave Caesar further for myself and took the constructive criticism of some game reviewers into account. This resulted in using 3 double-sided half-game boards with 8 different track combinations and advanced games play for cracks, even though my family and friends still only wanted to play the basic version. Unfortunately, ASS was struggling at this point, and although the product management was innovative and visionary, they simply didn't have enough resources. The result? Ausgebremst is a good game, but not a great product. I designed the tracks, but had no influence on the cars or graphics. The box size was a little too big, but at the time most boxes were too big, because the boxes and the game price had to be in proportion. That was a general marketing rule back then. Still is, by the way. Even now in the days when we're buying most of our games online, we're still getting these oversized boxes. Remember that the vast majority of game buyers at the time were not hardcore players, but grandmas, parents, and aunties. I'm delighted that Ausgebremst still has a devoted fan base today. Tip: we always play with micro machines from Louis Galoob Toys because of their perfect size and looks. So if you want to kind of bling out your version of Ausgebremst, look at getting some micro machine racing cars. In 2004, Möbius released QJet 21XX, a game identical in play to Ave Caesar, but with a sci-fi setting and a much smaller box. Were there any challenges or interesting stories related to the making of QJet? No. QJet 21XX was all easy. Möbius wanted to do exactly what they did. I had no influence on it. Great graphics, great spaceships. So the next 2 questions are related to, I use BGG a lot, Board Game Geek, for research, but it's only as good as the content that's entered into it. And so I have some questions based on what's in BGG, and I just wanted to know what the reality is. Next question. BGG's information seems a bit muddled when it comes to the 2006 edition listing Asmodee, Cafe Games, and Pro Ludo. Who was the original publisher you worked with? What were some of the design goals with the changes in this version? For example, this edition doesn't have dedicated tracks for different player counts, and the tracks seem shorter, more forgiving. Pro Ludo was the original publisher, and it was later acquired by Asmodee. Pro Ludo had their office in Constance, on Lake Constance, the beautiful lake where I grew up. Don't know why Cafe is listed. I was very enthusiastic about Pro Ludo publishing Ave Caesar again and worked out a very comprehensive new concept for them, but they weren't responsive. I didn't hear much from them until the game was finished. The graphics were fine, but unfortunately the tracks had a number of errors and I didn't get a chance to correct them. So that's the explanation as to why this version of Ave Caesar is the gentler, more forgiving version, which is not what you want in a chariot racing game. Come on! He seems to think they were errors. I don't know. Maybe they were errors, or they could have been an attempt by the publisher to try to make it more forgiving. If so, bad editorial decision. Now the next one, I've always wondered about this. Not that long after this version came out, BGG got a listing in its database for a Curse 1, which seemed to be an expansion with more tracks. So I asked him about that. It looks to have been an expansion track intended for the 2006 edition but never released. How far into the planning stages did this get to, and what were some of the things you intended for this expansion? Answer is, I have no idea, never heard of it. Interesting. So they were planning on publishing new tracks for Ave Caesar and didn't seem to get the designer involved in that at all. There were also different tracks in the 2015 edition from Brazilian publisher Grow. The tracks seem more challenging and unforgiving, at least compared to the 2006 edition. Did you design these tracks or the publisher? So I want to explain my next sentence here. I believe the folks at Grow to be big fans of the game, and I can imagine the desire for fans to make their own extra challenging tracks must be huge. I can't tell you a reason I feel this way. Just the vibe I got from this edition, from what I've read about it, I felt like the editors, whatever, at Grow Games really loved the game. I think it's because the tracks are especially challenging, and I would expect fans of the game, if they were making their own tracks, they would make a very challenging track, right? They wouldn't make an easy track like in this one. They'd make a more challenging track, right? With like in one track with a big long, wall separating two lanes, and if you're on one side, you can't get over to the pit lane. Wonderfully brutal. When Grow approached me about a license for Brazil, I was of course open to it. They'd already started the game development when their experienced product manager left the company. His successor was, as far as I know, new in the business, but she did quite well. However, they only wanted to publish the 2 tracks from the Pro Ludo game, but they were open to some updates. I was able to rework the tracks a little. The game rules also include some advanced gameplay, but naturally in Portuguese. Fun fact, I suggested that with a male theme like a Roman chariot race in a macho country like Brazil, there should also be a heroic woman on the box cover who could look like Shakira, so that women could be specifically targeted for the game too. Grow loved the idea and did it. The cover shows a female chariot racer. It's quite nice art in this edition, I have to say. Yeah, so this is sort of the fixed version of this. The Grow Games has sort of the same tracks as this one, but more challenging versions of those. And finally, we have this new deluxe edition from Dice Tree. It really feels like the definitive version of the game, with a variable board and the 7 best ever variants. Some are intended to make the gameplay like Ausgebremst, but others seem new. What was the inspiration behind them? What experience did you want to create with these variants? And were you inspired at all by any of the many fan variants from over the years? I am so glad my Korean friends didn't hesitate to take up the opportunity to develop the best Ave Caesar ever. They were grateful for the whole new concept that we sent them, and for the German and English translation of the game rules, too. It was a pleasure working so closely with them, and they never gave up in these past challenging years, which caused a lot of delays. My intention was clear, to enthrall all the existing Ave Caesar and Ausgebremst fans with a game that leaves little to be desired, but also to convince hardcore gamers for whom the basic rules are not challenging enough. The 7 variants are my own ideas, and I suppose sort of a natural progression of the basic game. I can imagine there are some similar and many more good variants out there among the fans, but I'm afraid I don't know them. I have to admit that I haven't been following the game's forums so far, but I guess I will now. The variants specifically offer advanced players plenty of options and variations to secure their very own serious Ave Caesar. I love the idea that everyone, hobby players and hardcore gamers alike, can play their very own personal game, made to measure gaming, so to speak. Let's see if it works out. I do have an opinion on that, by the way. it's a nice idea for a game to have multiple, like to be flexible enough to offer different experiences to different people, right? So one group can enjoy it in one way, another group can enjoy it another way. I find in practice, using different rule sets for those doesn't really work. What happens is it ends up kind of splitting the player base a bit. I don't mind when there's like 2 different versions, but when you have, in this, you have 4 or 5 options and 7 best ever variants. And what's going to happen is everybody plays the game a different way. And you saw this with Eagle Airgun, which is another game that I have, a racing game that I have covered. Tons and tons of variants, and that's great, but then it almost becomes a game before you play, like, well, what variants do we play with, right? Just my opinion. Tip, Dice Tree felt that 8-track variations are plenty, but the tracks can be played anti-clockwise too, which amounts to 16 track variations in all. Throw a dice before a race. Even numbers are clockwise, uneven numbers are anti-clockwise. Yeah, in this edition, the starting spaces are numbered, but you can ignore them. It doesn't really matter. So one difference in the new version compared to the other versions of Ave Caesar is that in all the older editions, all 6 chariots line up in a row adjacent to each other. So every chariot will move the same number of spaces, or need to in order to finish. Ausgebremst, having an auto racing setting, does a more like an F1 type of grid where you have, the starting 2 and then the back 2 like that. And this version is similar to Ausgebremst in that the starting line has 3 chariots, and the other 3 chariots have to start 1 space back, so they have to move an extra space over the course of the whole race. Puts them at a bit of a disadvantage. I'm interested in the reasoning behind the change in the starting lineup, with some chariots, starting 1 space back. Of course, this is the case in Ausgebremst, but I don't think Ave Caesar ever had this, so I wanted to ask about the thinking behind the change. Just 1 starting row means, as before, that the track at the start and finish must be 6 spaces wide. Even if the spaces become narrower than normal playing fields, they reduce the area for the track layout considerably for the 8 tracks. Also, with 6 chariots in tight spaces, it's more tricky to handle the chariots. Of course, 2 starting rows being a disadvantage of an extra moving point for the 3 players behind, but remember, now only the second row may start with a 6. And so you can imagine when you're putting 2 boards together, a lot of space is going to be taken up with the 6 lanes, and the long track goes from 2 lanes up to 6, including the pit, and then back down to 2. And it takes up a lot of board space, and it removes variability in terms of the rest of the space you have on the board that you have room to work with to make more interesting, varied tracks. So I think that's interesting. Yeah, and I am aware, I do want to say that with 2 starting rows, the front row goes first, but they can't play a 6. Back row can play a 6. I know, I'm still not 100% convinced that that's enough of a change, enough of a difference. I feel like having to move an extra space is kind of a pretty big disadvantage. I mean, it doesn't bother me because, if I'm playing with new players, I'll volunteer to be in the back. If we were to sit down and play a game of Ave Caesar together, what variants would you prefer to use? Are there any house rules you personally use that have not been published? I'd like to know if there's a director's cut of the rules, the way the designer likes to play. No, there's no director's cut of the rules, and if you ask me what variants I would prefer to use, well, it's just like having a party. See who's there, and you know what music will go down well. It's the same with the games variants. If there are less than 6 players, I would always suggest the Team Gladiator variant. That's with a dummy chariot, so you're always playing with 6. And if you like playing real mean, add variant 2, the Ram attacks, to the play, but I warn you, it needs solid personalities around the playing table for that. I also like playing, dare I say, 6 rounds for cash. This is variant 7, and they include tokens to allow you to play it for not real money, but it sounds like he's talking about real money. It's great fun when real coins are piled up in the grandstand, ready to be collected at the finish line in each of the 6 rounds. But damn it, not for you if you drive through Imperator Lane to get a new card deck. Believe it or not, we often play with up to 9 players. Luckily, I have enough cards and chariots for extra players. This can be a lot of fun. Just sit back and watch players fighting for 6th place just like others fighting for victory. The interaction, the emotions, the laughter, the whining, the love and hate are all a part of it. Just wonderful. At the end of the night, we're all winners. I like to mention, the emotions, the laughter, the whining. The whining can be fun too, Don't think of whining as a negative thing. It's like, oh, come on, how could you block me? He's running away with the victory, Get that table talk going, right? It's a lot of fun. With my last designer Q&A, I couldn't help but ask a similar question. It's my personal interest about how games have changed and game tastes have changed over time, that people want more and more of a solitary experience. I couldn't help but ask, Ave Caesar has a shared board with lots of blocking, and the trend lately has been everyone does their own thing with little interaction between players. Any thoughts on current trends? What sort of things do you love in a game, and do you see these things represented as often in newer games compared to older games? All the games people play now. Let's do without detailed analysis about new games in my response to your question. Now, I don't want to offend anyone, but the idea of everyone doing their own thing with little interaction between players sounds pretty boring to me, but sadly it's a general trend in society. The onset and spread of the digital revolution has facilitated this phenomenon. Think of the number of players who spend hours on their smartphones and/or in front of their computers with little interaction with real people. And it doesn't stop with the game scene. We are continually bearing witness to the decline of analog social ties, shifting to friends and likes in the digital community. Just take a look around and you're bound to spot the masses staring spellbound at their smartphones and dancing around the screen with their fingers, and totally oblivious to their environment. And as if that wasn't enough self-isolation, the trend was further boosted by enforced lockdowns, social distancing, masks, and anxiety over the last 3 years. But don't forget that we humans are social animals, so I hope we are soon at a turning point. Well, I definitely don't want to end up as a degenerate, lonely loser. We need each other for a good life, a laugh, a chat with a glass of good wine over a good pizza, and to share our ups and downs. I sincerely believe that this is our future together, and what better way to achieve that than by playing games with lots of interaction, fun, and fret. Happy together at one table. Amen to that. Thank you so much to Wolfgang Riedesser for reaching out and being open to the questions that I had for him, and allow me to revisit my favorite game of all time. Thank you for watching what will undoubtedly have been a very, very long episode. Remember, older games like Ave Caesar do not stop being good just because newer games come out. All right? All right. Take care.